When we talk about organizing trust in PKI, we're really talking about the trust model, the rules for who trusts whom and in what direction. In a hierarchical model, everything ultimately chains back to a single, or a very small number of, highly protected root authorities. That gives strong central control and simple validation, which is why the public web PKI uses it. In a mesh model, multiple organizations cross-certify each other. Trust is more distributed, which can be useful when peers need to cooperate without a single owner of the whole system. But it's harder to reason about and govern. A bridge model connects separate hierarchies so they can trust each other without merging. Think of it as an adapter between PKIs, often used in large governments or federations. Any of these can be deployed as public PKI, where many external parties rely on your roots, or as private PKI, where trust is limited to your enterprise. There is no one best design. Each option trades off control, scalability, risk, and operational complexity. Choosing the right architecture is a strategic decision, not just a technical one. A hierarchical or tree PKI is really about structured top-down trust. At the very top sits a single root certificate authority. That root is the ultimate trust anchor. If you trust the root, you can extend that trust downward. The root signs one or more intermediate CAs. Those intermediates then issue certificates to servers, users, and devices. Trust always flows in one direction, from the root to the intermediates to the end entities. When your browser validates a certificate, it walks back up this path to confirm that each step is signed by the one above it. This structure is popular because it's easy to reason about, scales well, and makes accountability clear. If something goes wrong with a certificate, you can trace exactly which CA issued it, and revoke at the right level. The downside is concentration of risk. If the root is ever compromised, everything beneath it becomes suspect. Long, deep chains can also add some validation overhead. That's why in practice we protect roots extremely carefully, and use intermediates for day-to-day operations. Designing a PKI means deciding how deep, how wide, and how many certificate authorities your hierarchy should have. A deep hierarchy introduces more levels between the root and the end entity certificates. That gives strong segregation. You can isolate regions, departments, or project teams, so that a compromise in one layer doesn't automatically affect everything else. The trade-off is more complexity, more hops in the chain, and often higher latency and operational overhead. A wide hierarchy keeps the structure relatively flat, but uses many parallel intermediates. This works well when you have huge certificate volumes, global footprints, or different security clearances, and you want faster validation and simpler chains. But every additional CA is another environment to secure, monitor, and audit. In practice, your branching strategy is driven by your company structure, geography, expected certificate volume, separation of duties, and how you plan to handle revocation and incidents. The key idea is that delegation and isolation needs shape the tree. You create sub-Ks wherever you need independent policy or risk boundaries, and you avoid depth that doesn't provide clear security or operational benefits. When your browser connects to a secure website, it doesn't just trust the certificate it sees. It walks a chain of trust, link by link, and every link has to pass. First, it checks the website's certificate signature using the issuer's public key. If that signature doesn't verify, trust stops immediately. If it does, the browser checks whether the certificate is still within its valid time window. An expired certificate means no trust, even if everything else looks fine. Next, it asks whether this certificate has been revoked. That's where CRLs and OCSP come in. If the issuing authority has marked the certificate as revoked, the browser must treat it as unsafe. The browser then climbs up to the issuer's certificate and repeats the same pattern. Verify the signature, check the dates, check for revocation, and move up again. Until it reaches a root certificate it already trusts locally. If any certificate in that chain is missing, expired, revoked, or uses an unacceptable algorithm, the whole connection is considered untrustworthy. Digital trust is only as strong as the weakest certificate in the chain. Up to now, we've focused on hierarchical PKI, where a root CA sits at the top. Now consider the opposite. A world with no central authority at all. In a peer-to-peer trust model, each participant decides whom to trust directly, often based on reputation or prior interactions. If you trust one party, and they in turn vouch for someone else, you might extend trust to that third party. That's transitive trust. This creates a web of overlapping trust relationships, instead of a single chain. The upside is resilience. There's no single route to compromise or take offline. And it can work well in small, tight-knit communities or specialized ecosystems. But the trade-offs are real. Trust becomes subjective and harder to reason about. It doesn't scale cleanly to millions of users. And automating policy and revocation is challenging. Keep this model in mind as a contrast, because formal PKI essentially tries to capture these human trust decisions, but in a more scalable and governable way. In a traditional PKI, trust flows from a central certificate authority. In a web of trust, it flows through people and their relationships. The process is straightforward. First, you meet someone in the real world and verify who they are, usually with strong identity documents. Then you both compare your public key fingerprints to make sure the keys you're about to trust haven't been swapped or tampered with. Once you're confident the key really belongs to that person, you use your own private key to sign their public key. Your signature is an attestation. I, with my reputation, vouch that this key belongs to this person. Over time, keys collect multiple signatures from different people. The more signatures and the more trustworthy those signers are, the higher the effective trust in that key. You can even trust someone you've never met if their key is strongly vouched for by people you already trust. This is the distance factor in the trust calculation. So instead of a single authority deciding who to trust, the network of participants collectively builds trust, one signed connection at a time. So far, we've talked about single PKI hierarchies, one root, its intermediates, and everyone trusting that tree. In the real world, though, different agencies, companies, or countries often run their own independent hierarchies, with their own policies and legal responsibilities. A bridge architecture is how you let those separate worlds trust each other, without forcing them to merge. At the center is a special certificate authority, the bridge CA. It doesn't usually issue end-user certificates. Instead, it issues cross-certificates. One hierarchy's root is certified by the bridge, and vice versa. Software that trusts the bridge can then build a valid chain, from a user in hierarchy A to a relying party in hierarchy B. This gives you federation. Each organization keeps its own root and policies, but users can still authenticate across domains. The trade-off is complexity. You now have to align CP and CPS documents, agree on assurance levels, and carefully manage which paths are considered trusted, so that one weak hierarchy doesn't undermine all the others. When we talk about open trust on the internet, we're really talking about the public certificate authorities that your browser already trusts by default. These root CAs are pre-installed in operating systems and browsers, and almost anyone, an individual, a startup, a bank, can request a certificate from them, as long as they pass the CA's validation checks. The upside is huge. Because these CAs are globally recognized, a certificate they issue is instantly accepted by billions of devices. They run professional, audited operations, carry liability insurance, and must comply with strict standards like the CA Browser Forum rules. That's what makes HTTPS work seamlessly when you visit a new website you've never seen before. But this model concentrates risk. Each big public CA becomes a high-value target. If one is compromised or makes a serious mistake, the impact can ripple across the entire internet. There's also the risk of political or nation-state pressure on these operators, because their decisions affect global communications. To reduce that risk, browsers require public CAs to log every certificate they issue into certificate transparency logs. Those public logs and the signed timestamps attached to certificates make it possible for organizations and researchers to detect fake or misissued certificates quickly and push browsers to distrust them. Now let's shift to a classic closed trust enterprise PKI model. Here, a single organization owns and operates the entire trust hierarchy. The internal root CA is usually kept offline and protected, and it delegates day-to-day issuance to one or more subordinate CAs. Only devices the organization controls are configured to trust this root, so the trust boundary is intentionally limited to the corporate environment. This model fits internal scenarios: VPN access, intranet sites, Wi-Fi, internal APIs, device and IoT certificates, even firmware signing. The big benefit is control. You define the certificate policies, validity periods, key sizes, and algorithms, without being forced to follow browser or public CA rules. At scale, it can also be cheaper, because you're not paying per certificate. The trade-off is responsibility. If you run your own PKI, you own the security, monitoring, backups, and incident response, 24/7. There's no external CA to blame if keys are compromised, or if an outage breaks authentication. So this model is powerful, but it demands strong operational maturity and clear governance. Modern enterprises rarely choose between public PKI and private PKI. They blend both in a hybrid model. Anything exposed to the internet, your main website, public APIs, partner portals, needs to be trusted by browsers and external systems you don't control. That's where public certificate authorities come in. They issue certificates that every major browser and operating system already trusts, which is essential for compliance and third-party integrations. Inside the organization, the needs are different. You may have millions of internal connections, employee devices, back-end services, databases, IoT devices, even robots on a factory floor. You want strong identity and encryption here too, but you need flexibility, automation, and low cost at very large scale. That's what a private PKI gives you: your own CAs, your own policies, and the ability to mint short-lived certificates for internal-only use. So the key design decision is not public or private, but for this specific use case, whose trust do I need? If you need the whole world to trust it, use public PKI. If you only need your organization and its systems to trust it, use private PKI. A good hybrid design draws a clear boundary between these zones and manages them with consistent governance, so users get seamless trust without you overexposing your internal infrastructure. Choosing a PKI trust model really means answering one simple question: who needs to trust whom, and at what scale? Start with the primary user. If your main audience is the external public, you typically rely on a public PKI and public CAs. In that world, you trade some control for global trust and 24/7 operations that someone else runs. If your focus is an internal enterprise with thousands of certificates, a private hierarchical PKI usually makes sense. You keep strong central control, well-defined routes and intermediates, and you design operations around your own security and compliance needs. When multiple separate organizations need to trust each other, a bridge CA can act like a translator. It lets each party keep their own hierarchy while establishing cross-trust between them. And if you have a small or decentralized group with no natural central authority, a mesh PKI can work better. Trust is distributed and each participant is more equal, but coordination becomes more complex. Across all of these choices, the trade-offs stay the same. Scaling from a few to millions of certificates, how much control you keep versus delegate, whether you operate everything yourself or use managed services, and how you balance upfront build costs against ongoing service fees. At this point, you've seen the three main PKI trust models. Now let's compare how they behave in the real world. Hierarchical PKI is simple and very scalable, which is why the public web uses it. The trade-off is a clear single point of failure. If the root is compromised or offline, the whole ecosystem is at risk. Operationally, it's easy to automate and strongly backed by standards, so it works well for millions of users, but you must invest heavily in protecting that root. Mesh PKI removes the single root, so there isn't one obvious point of failure. It's rarely used for broad consumer scenarios. It's more of a niche fit, where a few peer organizations need to trust each other, without a central authority. But that benefit comes with high complexity, poor scalability, and difficult automation. Bridge CAs sit in the middle. The bridge itself becomes the critical component, but it allows separate hierarchies to interoperate. Complexity and automation needs are moderate, costs are medium, and it's supported by standards. This makes bridge architectures attractive when you have multiple existing PKIs, like different business units or partner organizations, and you want them to trust each other, without redesigning everything from scratch. You've seen the main trust models in theory. Now let's look at how they show up in real organizations. First, internet scale companies rely on more than one PKI. They use public PKI to serve customers on the open internet, but a separate, tightly controlled private PKI to secure internal services and enforce zero trust. Same cryptography, completely different risk profile and policies. Second, in cloud and microservices environments, a hybrid pattern is common. Public certificates terminate traffic at the edge, for example, on a load balancer, while short-lived private certificates secure service-to-service calls inside clusters like Kubernetes. That gives user-facing trust that browsers understand, plus highly dynamic internal trust that can be automated and rotated frequently. Third, governments and large federations solve a different problem, connecting many independent hierarchies. They use bridge CAs to let separate PKIs trust each other, without forcing everyone into a single root. That enables cross-agency collaboration, while preserving each agency's autonomy. The key idea is that mature organizations rarely have one PKI. They combine public, private, and bridged models to match business needs, scale, and regulatory constraints. Traditional PKI gives us a chain of trust rooted in certificate authorities. What's happening today is that this trust model is stretching in several directions at once, rather than being replaced outright. One direction is decentralized identifiers. Instead of a central CA asserting your identity, you hold your own keys and identities, often anchored to a blockchain. That reduces single points of failure and gives users more control, but it also pushes more responsibility for key security and recovery to the edge. Another direction is zero trust PKI. Here, certificates tend to be short-lived and tied to continuous verification. A policy engine constantly evaluates signals like device posture, network context, and user behavior before granting access. The certificate becomes one ingredient in a real-time decision, not a long-term pass. We also see attribute-based PKI, where what matters is not just who issued this certificate, but what attributes does this identity have right now. Role, location, and risk level can all feed into access decisions, enabling much finer-grained control than static hierarchies. Finally, there's the shift to post-quantum PKI. Classical algorithms like RSA and ECC will eventually be vulnerable to quantum attacks. So organizations are beginning to adopt new quantum-safe algorithms and hybrid certificates that carry both traditional and post-quantum keys. That lets you stay compatible today while preparing for the cryptographic break of tomorrow. Overall, PKI is becoming more dynamic, more user-centric, and more resilient to future threats, while still answering the same fundamental question. Can I trust this identity right now for this action? You've now seen that PKI design is really about matching trust models to real business needs. At the highest level, you choose how different parts of your environment trust each other. A simple hierarchical model for clear top-down control. A mesh for peered or federated environments, or bridge elements when separate PKIs must interoperate without fully merging. Then you decide who you want to trust you. A public PKI when you need the whole internet to recognize your certificates. A private PKI when you want tight internal control. Or a hybrid that mixes both. For a company with a public website, many internal servers, thousands of employees, and VPN access, no single pattern is perfect. Public trust is essential for the website. But internal servers and user or VPN certificates are usually better served by a private enterprise PKI. The key idea to take away is this. Scale, security requirements, and user experience will push you toward different combinations. The real architecture emerges from how you balance control against convenience for each use case.